Welcome in, Falcons fans. Your boy Bryce Lewis back at again for more Atlanta Falcons content. And as we continue to move through this offseason, we get close to the training camp and football season starts to rear its head. We got to continue just talking about different things around the team as we get close to that point. And I wanted to bring on another new guest to the show, Aaron Freeman, host of Locked On Falcons. You may have seen him on different podcasts. You may have listened to him. You may be a very dedicated listener of his. So I appreciate Aaron coming on the pod, sharing his wisdom today. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. I'd be doing better if it was a little cooler outside. But you know, it's only going to get hotter from here. So that's what I'm dreading right now. But you know, getting some football back in our lives will make it a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It is extremely hot outside. Going outside and be out there for 10 seconds, come back in. Ooh, I'm sweating already.
I got a little glisten going on because I was just outside a couple of minutes ago. So yeah,
it's tough, man. But I guess this was part of it, man. But hey, like I said, man, I appreciate you coming on to the show. And so, first question I want to ask you, man, about the Falcons, obviously going into a big season for them. At this current moment in time, where this team is constructed with the roster and everything, how do you feel about the Atlanta Falcons?
Well, in general, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical than a lot of folks are, just because, we do this song and dance every year where it's like, this is going to be the year where the Falcons break through. And we've been waiting 7 years for this team to get that winning record, make it back to the playoffs. And at this point, I'm just like, I'll believe it when I see it. But I do think relative to the last 3 years, especially looking back at 2023, the final year of Arthur Smith, last year, in Raheem Morris's first year, I think you can make a much more compelling case that this year is their best shot to really have that sort of breakthrough season, particularly if you're buying into basically the idea that Michael Penix is going to raise the ceiling for this Falcons offense with his arm strength and adding a little bit more explosive capability and potential to this offense than what you've seen the last 2 years with Desmond Ridder and Kirk Cousins at the helm, and hopefully that a defense that now has some more speed and athleticism up front, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more juice as far as the pass rush is concerned. I do think this is potentially the best combination that they've had to have that through season and potentially end this playoff drought.
Yeah, and obviously, not making the postseason since 2016 has been tough for the team. And so, obviously a big question is obviously the remaining holes that they have. Some people ask about, or positions that people are not as sure with, are kind of the big talking points, I would say. Obviously, we just had Jaire Alexander sign with Baltimore a couple of days ago. CB2 has been a question for some people. Mike Hughes coming back, didn't play bad last year, in my opinion, but some people looking to see if we could get an upgrade there. Obviously, we heard that the Falcons were under consideration. I just want to ask your thoughts. Do you think the Falcons should have been more aggressive than maybe in pursuing a guy like a Jaire Alexander? And how do you feel about the cornerback 2 spot as of right now?
No, I don't think they should have been more aggressive than what they were. I certainly wouldn't have been like, oh no, if they signed Jaire Alexander, that's a bad move. Obviously, getting a player of his caliber, even the big question was sort of durability and availability with Jaire Alexander. But even if he only played 4 games this year, the 4 games that he would play would make your defense significantly better than you would be without him. But at the same time, I do feel like the Falcons, I would tend to be hesitant for the Falcons to go out there and make a big splash this summer in terms of bringing in a veteran, because I think one of the important elements about this season that we didn't quite get to see last season is that you want to find out what you have with a lot of these young players, right? Terry Fontenot, the Falcons general manager, is someone that's basically been kind of under fire. People were basically calling for him to lose his job. And ultimately, I think one of the things that you want to be able to come out of this season, basically being able to have a referendum on Terry Fontenot, whether or not he should be able to maintain his job, not only based off of the success of the team, but you want to be able to look at this roster with honest and open eyes and really see how stocked the cupboard is when it comes to young talent. And basically at this point, any veterans that you sign, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, are potentially going to block young players from playing. Like in the case of Jaire Alexander, you sign him to be your outside corner. That probably bumps Mike Hughes inside, where you potentially just drafted Billy Bowman with the expectation that he's going to, come in and compete and win that nickel cornerback spot. And if that if you sign a Jair Alexander, Bowman is unlikely to be able to win that spot over someone like a Mike Hughes. When it comes to Mike Hughes, I certainly understand why people are not sold on him. I certainly think when you look at the Falcons defense overall, he's probably one of the bigger question marks. Like you, Bryce, I agree with you. I thought he was solid last year. Not amazing, not spectacular, but solid. And so I feel like he's good enough for that. If the other elements of your defense, go according to plan, and he winds up only needing to be like the 9th or 10th best player on your defense, like you're probably in a good spot. Now, if we get to the season and the other pieces aren't stepping up and some of those young players that we're talking about, and now you need Mike Hughes to be like the 5th or 6th best player on your defense, then I think you're going to be stretched a little bit too thin, and you're going to leave a little bit, wanting from Mike Hughes than what you're going to get. But I think for the time being, Mike Hughes, I think you have bigger fish to fry in the sense of you want to see, players at other positions sort of shine. And if that's the case, I think you're going to be able to sleep well at night with Mike Hughes at that outside quarterback spot.
Yeah, and I think it's too that you made a good point about the young players. And like I said, there's a lot of expectations this year, and they are relying on those young players to step up. And you mentioned Billy Bowman, a guy who some people say, is he a favorite for that spot? Obviously, D. Alford will be back. This year. And then also Clark Phillips is also going to be competing for that spot. So in terms of that nickel spot, there's going to be a lot of competition there. How are you feeling about that? Because I feel like regardless of who wins the position, there is some depth there. I feel like that's obviously a strength at the end of the day is, hey, do we have some guys, if something did happen, we got other guys who can fill in. But how do you feel about that spot? Is it Billy Bowman's to lose?
I think, it's hard to say if it's Billy Bowman's to lose, but I certainly think that if it's close, like their thumbs will be pressed on the scale to give Billy Bowman that opportunity, right? I think there's obvious reasons why the Falcons feel like they can get better at that spot based off of how D. Alford played last year and the fact that Clark Phillips, as we sit here today, is virtually unproven as a nickel cornerback outside of a handful of reps that he's gotten there over the last couple of summers. And so there's a golden opportunity for Billy Bowman to win that spot. So I do feel like, it's hard for me to sit here and say, like, I don't know if I would bet on him being the week one starter, but it's close enough where it's almost a coin toss at this stage for him. And that's better odds than you typically have for a rookie winning a starting spot. And I think ultimately the goal is, I think you're right in the sense of, because you have three options there, and you can also throw in, a Natron Brooks. I've heard, talk about Kevin King maybe getting some looks there. You have a lot of bodies there with the idea that, the cream rises to the top, and through the power of competition, somebody's going to, whoever winds up emerging through the course of training camp is going to be at least a decent option for you going into the season. And I feel like that's a relatively good strategy, particularly at a spot that was such a problem area for your defense last year. If you're not going to go out there and get that obvious outright, massive upgrade, this offseason, then just basically bolstering the competition, I think, should lead to positive results.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, competition is always considered a good thing, pushes players to be better. Your job's not safe, and gives that push of just that sense of competition within the position group. Now, I ask people about this because I just want to know your thoughts. Obviously, there were some undrafted free agents that they picked up that people were kind of excited about sticking in the secondary. I think going back outside, Cobee Bryant is a guy who some people feel like, should have been drafted in a lot of people's eyes. And I think he was one of the best. Well, he was one of the top guys in interceptions, also in the country last year. Do you think that Cobee makes the team? Do you see a path? Like, how are you feeling about him? Because, Raheem mentioned he told him, like, hey, we didn't even take a corner in the draft, and we brought you in and trying to sell him on coming to the team. So is he a guy that you'll be very interested and curious at kind of keeping an eye on when camp starts?
Yeah, I definitely will be keeping an eye on him because, as you mentioned, like, he's gotten a lot of hype at this point in time. And I liked Cobee Bryant in the pre-draft process, but I primarily liked him as more of a nickel guy because I questioned whether or not he had this sort of size, length, and athleticism to hold up outside at that position full time. And so to me, I'm less intrigued by Cobee Bryant than I was maybe before the draft, just because of the presence of Billy Bowman and some of the other options at the Falcons nickel quarterback spot. And, obviously the Falcons have a vested interest in Billy Bowman's success as opposed to Cobee Bryant, although they have a vested interest in that. But, the difference between a 4th round pick and an undrafted guy, obviously, you want to see your 4th round pick succeed. So like I'm intrigued by Cobee Bryant. I'll be, in my initial roster projection, I did not have him making the roster just because I wasn't necessarily as convinced as other people are that he's ready to go as an outside corner. He was very effective in college. But, I don't want to disparage Big 12 corners and Big 12 wide receivers. Historically speaking, unless you play for Oklahoma or Travis Hunter, being a receiver in the Big 12 is not necessarily a sign of NFL success. And so even though I think Cobee Bryant was very effective in college, I do feel like you probably would have gotten a different result had he played in the SEC or the ACC or the Pac-12. And so that's a question I have. And so that will only get answered once we get to camp and see him, going up against some of the receivers that the Falcons have in practice. So I think that he has a much better chance than your typical undrafted free agent making the roster. But at the end of the day, I'm right now expecting him more as a practice squad option, just because I think presences of more established veterans like Keith Taylor, Kevin King, that have a little bit more size and a little bit more length, which is something that the Falcons are lacking at that cornerback position outside of AJ Terrell. Having more bodies like that in the room, that if the Falcons want to be able to play press man coverage, particularly when you talk about sort of what is the ideal option opposite AJ Terrell, like Mike Hughes isn't the ideal option, right? We know that AJ Terrell is really good against speed and quick wide receivers, not so much against size. Mike Evans has been a problem for him. I saw AJ recently on a podcast. Basically, he was asked like point blank, who's the hardest guy to cover? And he was like, Mike Evans. Had no thought whatsoever. That's like immediately came to his mind. He didn't even have to sit there and think about it. So that tells you how much Mike Evans has sort of impacted. And so all that to say is like having more corners with more size to deal with the Mike Evanses of the world, the Keon Coleman's of the world, all these bigger wide receivers that the Falcons are going to see this season, to me is a little bit more valuable than what Cobee Bryant is bringing to the table. But certainly if Cobee Bryant goes out there and plays as well as he did in the Big 12 at the Shrine Bowl, where he was locking down guys, then, certainly not going to complain about him, being, one of those options as a depth piece on the outside.
Yeah, and obviously if you have undrafted free agents who make the roster, that just kind of goes to show the scouting department's doing their job, finding guys who can come in and try to contribute, whether that's special teams or right on the field with snaps right away. So definitely something to keep an eye on. But let's move to the front end of the defense that can help the back end. And let's start on the D-line. The D-line obviously has been, the edge room especially, has been very much questioned with the lack of sacks the Falcons have gotten over, the past decade, really. Going past that. And this offseason, I think people felt a renewedness in that room because of how aggressive they were in the draft. You added veterans like Leonard Floyd, Morgan Fox as well. You still got Arnold Ebiketie coming back for another season. And then, adding Jalen Walker, adding James Pierce Jr. Where do you stand with the edge group right now on this team? Do you also have that revigorated confidence in the room? Obviously, we have to wait till they hit the field. But do you feel, I guess, as strongly about this room as maybe like in the last few years?
Yeah, I think this is the most talented edge room that they've had. This is the deepest edge room that they've had in a very long time here in Atlanta. And mostly from what you're saying, because of the infusion of talent with the additions of Jalen Walker and James Pierce in the draft. I think prior to that, you were just kind of like, okay, Leonard Floyd, Arnold Ebiketie, Braylon Trice, those guys are solid, but is that drastically different than what they had last year? Because Leonard Floyd and Matthew Judon, same age, sort of, you can look at some of the more advanced metrics about their pass rush win rates and sort of similar declines. And are you going to get a significantly better version of Leonard Floyd than you got in terms of Matthew Judon last year? I think that was an open question before the draft. And then you question, okay, what is Braylon Trice going to be coming off that ACL injury? Is Arnold Ebiketie going to make another jump? So similar questions, I think, that we've seen in that edge room prior to the draft from previous years. And then you bring in two talented players like Jalen Walker and James Pierce. Many people thought these were, in the running with Abdul Carter, and some people thought they were better than Abdul Carter in terms of the best edge rushers in this draft class. So guys that are very talented, very easy to see that when you watch their film. For me, the one sort of point of hesitancy or skepticism I have is the Falcons are relying a lot on young pass rushers, rookie pass rushers, to kind of bolster that unit. And when you look at sort of the average production of a first round edge rusher over the last, 10, 15 years as a rookie, you're typically talking about guys that are getting 5 sacks, 30 pressures. And again, that would be a welcome addition. If you could get 2 of those, sort of production, that's basically a 10 sack season between James Pierce and Jalen Walker. And that's certainly something that the Falcons have not had from an individual player. But if 2 heads are better than one, I guess you could say. I guess for me, the one part where I'm not as necessarily as optimistic as other people are is just because you're so loaded in that edge room. Like, are you going to get those guys the opportunities that you want with veterans like Floyd and Ebiketie to sort of shine in a ways that they are capable of shining? And, ultimately, are they showing you that they are capable of carving out a significant part of the rotation? So I think it's good that the Falcons are deep at the position. I think that probably leads to the team, not necessarily having one individual player sort of be the star, but I think the idea behind the Falcons, and you heard Jeff Ulbrich and Nate Ollie, their new defensive line coach, talk about this, they would just want to have waves of pass rushers at attacking quarterbacks. You saw something similar 2 years ago when the Falcons had their best pass rusher they had in terms of sack production, getting over 40 sacks for the first time in 20 years in 2023. And a big part of what Ryan Nielsen wanted to do, the then defensive coordinator, was have a deep rotation of players. And so I'm hoping that you will have a similar thing where you may not necessarily have one guy that's going to get 8 or 10 or more sacks, but you'll have 5 or 6 guys that are each getting 5 or 6, maybe 7 or more sacks. And so that's how you get to 40 plus sacks that would, to me, are reflective of a defense and a pass rush that is quote unquote playoff caliber. So I do feel like there is absolutely a path where this defensive line with some of the young players leads to success. But in terms of some of the more loftier expectations of like, oh, you're going to have multiple guys that get 8 to 10 or more sacks this year, I'm a little skeptical of that. But I don't think that's going to be something that is guaranteed to prevent this team from reaching their goals defensively and with their pass rush.
Yeah, and I think too, as you mentioned, with the young guys across the line of scrimmage, relying on them is a bit of a risk. I mean, but I also get it from Raheem's standpoint. The Rams, I believe, last year before he left, they had drafted 2 rookies. They both were productive for them. And so maybe he's hoping to get that same type of production in Atlanta, because sometimes you go off blueprints, as we've seen in this league. Oh, we have success doing it here. We could maybe have success with similar guys who we think have similar DNA, similar skill types in this, in this team. So we're going to have to see what happens with that. Now, 2 guys in the defensive line also who are going to be expected to step up, Dorlus and Ruke. Those guys are going to be under a spotlight. Ruke, I feel like more just because we traded up for him, and he's essentially the Grady Jarrett replacement for this team. And then Dorlus just more because he didn't really play a lot last year, so we don't know what he is. But obviously, Nate Ollie's came in and talked about the plan they have for him, moving a bit to more of like kind of that big edge position for them. So what do you want to see from those 2 guys this year on the field?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the question marks across the D-line, like these are the 2 bigger ones for, I think, the reasons that you mentioned, just because we didn't get to really see Dorlus at all last year, so we don't really have a clue what he's going to bring. I thought for, the 12 snaps or whatever it was that he played last year, I thought he did some good work on those snaps. And the same thing goes with Ruke, who played roughly 150 or so snaps and did good work there. But there are big shoes to fill, as you mentioned, with Grady Jarrett and departing with those 2 guys. And so in terms of what I want to see, like, I'm not going into the season expecting either one of these guys to fill those shoes, but I'm hoping that by the end of the season, piggybacking on something I talked about earlier, with trying to figure out, who's good and who's not when it comes to some of these young pieces, are we going to be able to talk about Ruke or Dorlus by the end of the season, being like, okay, given that we kind of got a redshirt year in this 2025 season is more of a true rookie season for both of these guys, are you feeling good about where these guys are at the end of the season? I don't expect it, as I said, for it to completely come together. I would love to be wrong and on that. But, I'm expecting it more to be like, okay, you saw some flashes, and how consistent are those flashes? Are you seeing a disruptive player? Are you seeing a guy that is consistent with manning their gap and with their run fits and all those various, just kind of the little things that you're looking for young players that you can say, okay, we can build off of this into the future. And I think that's for me what I'm expecting and hoping to see from those guys, rather than necessarily this sort of dominant season. And I think, again, that's part of the reason why I think it's one of the bigger question marks, because it's like, you're counting on a bunch of young, talented players at the edge rusher room. You're counting on a bunch of young, talented players at the tackle room. But I think probably what the floor for what you're expecting from Ruke and Dorlus is probably lower than what you're expecting from guys like Pierce and Walker, among others in that edge rusher room. So I think that's a legit question at this point in time. And I'm just hoping that by the year's end, we will see, a solid floor for those guys that tells you, hey, these are guys, whether they're going to be long-term starters, we don't know, but they can at least be reliable and valuable rotational players, and hopefully you get a couple of flashes of that potential ceiling of maybe these guys could turn into disruptive and top-notch starters down the road.
Yeah, and if all that works out, obviously buy these guys on rookie deals too. So you're also hoping for the Falcons don't have to maybe spend a lot of money right now. Obviously, we'll have to see about the future, but helps get some guys in there on rookie deals, build maybe some other places. And if they end up working out, that only can just bode well in terms of team building, because they did talk about how they want to try to build a winner, but sustain winner. Like, you're building for the future, building now, which was a whole conversation as well. So let's go over to the offensive side of the ball now. Obviously, this is the part of the ball where I think there is a higher expectation for the offense to be good, just because there's a lot of talent. They still had a really good offense last year, even though there was some, Kirk had to go through his thing and everything like that. But like you mentioned earlier, you talked about Michael Penix and how they think he's raising the ceiling of the Falcons. We've heard Zac Robinson mention they're going to open up the offense more. We've heard Bijan say he wants to have a Saquon-like year. They have expectations to be the best offense in the league. So starting with Michael Penix, coming into his first full year as the starter, what are some things that you're looking at with him that you are like, regardless of how the season goes, if he does this, I feel good about the quarterback position for the Falcons moving forward?
I think for me, the main thing that I'm looking for with Michael Penix is not necessarily how he starts the season, but how he finishes the season. I think that's been a big factor in why the Falcons have struggled to make the playoffs these last couple of years, is that usually we've seen, I think, 3 years now in a row, starting in 2022, where the Falcons by like week 7, week 8 are in first place in the NFC South. And then somehow the Bucs overtake them by the end of the season. And a main reason for that is how good the Bucs have been basically after Thanksgiving. I think the last 2 years with Baker Mayfield at the helm, I think their combined record after Thanksgiving is like 10-3, while the Falcons record is like, I don't know, like 5 and whatever it is. I can't 5-8 or something like that. And so like, it's one of those things where, like, for me with Michael Penix, where I would feel really good about him turning into that franchise quarterback that the Falcons obviously want him to be, is if he shows that he can turn it on when the Falcons need it down the stretch, because that has been sorely lacking. That's something that the Falcons really haven't had since the heyday of Matt Ryan, where you could trust that your quarterback play down the stretch was going to be really solid. Obviously, as you mentioned, we all saw Kirk Cousins basically fall apart down the stretch, depending on what how much you want to blame the injury, how much you want to blame all that stuff. But, at the end of the day, it happened. And so hopefully, I think that to me is kind of the main thing with Penix. And I think there's a lot of reason for me to be optimistic that he'll be able to achieve that, just because I think, he's shown the poise, that sort of clutch gene in limited opportunities last year. You've also sort of seen him show, progress from one game to the next in terms of improving things. And so when you imagine, him after 12 plus games this upcoming season, if he can continue to build on that across 12 more starts, the type of quarterback that I think he's capable of being could be that type of guy that we could see the Falcons go 5-1 down the stretch. And I think they'll need that if they're going to make a legitimate playoff push. So I think ultimately you just want to see, for me, Penix get better as the season progresses. And if he does, I think things will wind up taking care of themselves, and we'll feel, regardless of what the record finishes, we'll feel a lot better about the future going forward with Michael Penix. So that's the main thing. I want to see him finish this season strong, and hopefully we're sitting here in December talking about some of the best performances he's had all season long. And I think if the Falcons can pull that off and Penix can pull that off, I think you'll feel really good about him being your franchise quarterback moving forward.
Yeah, and I think too, that really helps. It's just the base he had coming into the season. I think we've kind of seen rookie quarterbacks or quarterbacks who enter the league who have played more snaps at college have come in and had a little bit more success early. I mean, if you think about the top rookies from last year's class, Daniels played 4 or 5 years. He started. Penix was a starter for 4 or 5 years. And the guys who were kind of shaky were like 1-2 year guys who maybe played. And so I think that helped with just him coming into the league and things of that nature. And so, obviously with him taking that next step as the Falcons quarterback, people do wonder still in that room with Kirk Cousins still there, could that have any impact? Now, Kurt's been a professional. He's came to the mandatory things. He'll come in training camp. I don't think he'll do anything in terms of ruining chemistry or anything like that. But I can understand why some people want him out the room just so there's he's just not there. Just that shadow is there. Right now, it doesn't seem like there is a place for Kirk. Do you expect that to remain that way? Do you see Kirk being on this with this team the whole year, trade deadline? What are you thinking about that whole Kirk situation?
Yeah, I don't expect Kirk to go anywhere. I haven't, basically since the Browns signed Joe Flacco back in early April. And it, to me, was pretty clear at that point that the Steelers were on a path to signing Aaron Rodgers. The whole game of musical chairs on which team was going to have a starting quarterback spot opening, potentially for Kirk Cousins to waive his no trade clause in order for the go to him. To me, that kind of shut the door on that. And so you're now counting on an injury, a significant injury to a starter that's going to, basically knock a guy out for the season. And you need the circumstance where that team not only has the cap space to take on whatever, they and the Falcons agree to when it comes to splitting Kirk's contract. They need to be probably a coaching staff on the hot seat that feels the pressure to win. And so that pushes them to acquire Kirk Cousins. They need to not necessarily like their current backup quarterbacks. And so when you try to figure out what team is going to check all of those boxes, it feels like to me there's a very, very low probability of a Kirk trade developing. Not zero, but probably less than 1%. And so I think there's like a 99% probability that Kirk Cousins remains a Falcon for the remainder of the season. And when it comes to the dynamic within the room, I tend to be one of these people where, you would ideally want Kirk away so that you don't have to deal with the possibility. Again, I think you nailed it in the sense of there's a very low probability of Kirk making waves or whatever, but there's that I don't want to say slim or anything like that, but there is that possibility that what happens if the Falcons get off to a poor start? What if they start the season 0-4? What if they start the season 1-5 or something like that? And then that raises the question of, given there's pressure for this regime to get results this year, do they stick it out with Michael Penix through the growing pains if they're feeling like they're on the hot seat or whatever? And so, again, chances of that happening are probably low, but that's where I think wanting to have Kirk out of the room so that you don't necessarily feel that knee-jerk reaction where we're going to have a situation like we saw with the Colts last year with Anthony Richardson, and we saw 2 years ago with Arthur Smith and Desmond Ridder, where you have a young quarterback that you're trying to develop, and then the coaching staff is like, we're not winning games at the rate that we need to win, and so let's go with the veteran player, and that throws a wrench in that young quarterback's development. And so I think that's the reason why you want Kirk out the door, but because I don't think that's a likely outcome, nor do I think a trade is likely to develop for Kirk Cousins, you're probably just stuck with him and hoping for the best. And, given Penix's injury history, there's a decent chance that he may not play all 17 games, and you might need Kirk to step in there for 2 or 3 games. No one's better. There's probably not a better backup quarterback in the NFL than Kirk Cousins at this point in time. So at least in that possibility outcome, you do have a reliable backup that could wind up being the difference between this team, winning the games that they need to win to make the playoffs. And so we may be sitting here being like, oh man, it was a great thing that they didn't trade Kirk Cousins because he had to start 4 games and the Falcons went 3-1 in those games. And that was the reason why they wound up ultimately winning 10 plus games and winning the division.
Yeah. And 2 on top of that, I've asked too, if you look past Kirk, it's Easton Stick and Emory Jones. So I think some people are like, all right, it's not the most courageous backup quarterback room outside of that. And they're competing just to maybe get that, practice squad spot, essentially, even though you can have the emergency quarterback in that situation. But if you move Kirk, now it's like, all right, do you trust your backup quarterback if something like you said did happen to Penix? So that's something, obviously, I'm sure if that does come to it, they'll address that and figure that out along with that. So now let's move to the receiver room real quick. Obviously, we know Drake London, He's a guy who has been a stud for this team, gotten better every year statistically. And I think as a receiver, Darnell Mooney was a great, I don't want to say surprise, because Darnell Mooney I knew could hoop before he came here. But, when you saw how Chicago was last few years, you're kind of like, all right, well, is he? Some people were like, is this Mohamed Sanu all over again? When they signed him, and everyone's like, but it ended up working out. But I think the biggest thing was Ray McCloud. I think first time being a receiver, and him kind of emerging as that slot. It's because last year when they had him and Rondale Moore, you could tell they want more speed at that spot to do screens, get those guys in space. Now I think, you pretty much know Ray, Cordell Hodge, and then I'm thinking Jamal Agnew for special teams reasons. And so a question is like, are the Falcons going to keep 6 receivers? Because if that's the case, you're looking at Casey Washington, Nick Nash, Chris Blair, some other guys battling for that spot. So I just wanted to ask you, first, do you think they'll keep more than 5? And second, who do you like to maybe emerge out of that group to be able to make the team?
Yeah, I think they'll keep more than 5. I think they'll keep 6. I think at this point it's a toss-up. I probably, for most of this offseason, have been operating that Casey Washington is probably the front runner at that spot, just because I think ultimately that 6 wide receiver is probably not going to see a lot of opportunities on offense and is going to need to contribute on special teams. And that was a big reason why the Falcons ultimately selected Casey Washington in the 6th round of last year, because they saw the potential for him in terms of his upside on special teams. But given that the Falcons did invest quite a bunch of resources in terms of adding depth that has special teams value, and Casey Washington missed a large chunk of the season with a concussion, and then you couple that with the recent release of Jace McClellan, one of 3 6th round picks that they had last year. 2 of them are gone. McClellan now, Zion Lowe. It does feel like there is a sort of subtle indication that maybe the coaching staff is not necessarily counting as much on Casey Washington to be the guy. And I think if that's the case, then it's kind of a wide open competition. I know Nick Nash, the undrafted free agent out of San Jose, is getting a lot of love, and certainly based off his production. I think he was the Triple Crown winner or the equivalent of that in college in terms of having the most targets, catches, yards last year in college football. Doesn't have a ton of experience on special teams, so I think that's going to matter. But I think, it's pretty much a wide open spot. And ultimately, I think all these guys, potentially could benefit from working with a quarterback like Kirk Cousins on the 2nd string, as opposed to, Easton Stick or Emory Jones or whatnot. So, if you were forcing me to sort of answer, I would say it's probably going to be either Casey Washington or Nick Nash for that 6th spot. But it would not shock me if we get to the regular season and it's someone like Quincy Skinner or Mekhi Polk or Chris Blair or somebody like that is not necessarily getting as much attention as we sit here today, that ultimately wins that spot. Because I do think special teams is going to matter. Production on the field is going to matter. Like those guys shining in the 3rd quarters of preseason games when we're all sort of mentally checked out of the game. We're like, like, what's going on? And it's like, there's the 7th catch of the game for Chris Blair or whoever. And all of a sudden, those are going to be the things that I think go a long way to resolving that ultimate spot. Because I agree with you right now. I think the top 5 guys are pretty much locked into their spots, assuming barring injury and whatnot. And I think overall, this wide receiver group is pretty good. I agree with you. I went into last season, with low expectations on Darnell Mooney. I'm like, well, he had a 1,000-yard season 3 years ago, and then the last 2 seasons hasn't really produced that. And I think that's probably the real version of Darnell Mooney. And then we got, I think, even a better version of Darnell Mooney than what we saw in any of the 4 years that he was in Chicago. And so hopefully with that and Drake London and hopefully improvements from guys like McLeod and Hodge, I think, even though this isn't, the deepest group of wide receivers, I think your top 2 guys are one of the better duos in the NFL, probably a top 5 duo in the NFL. And I think you can say, there are teams that have much better guys that are 3 through 5 or 3 through 6 than this group. But I think you see enough from Hodge and McLeod. And I as a vocal critic of Zac Robinson last year, I think one of the things I can't criticize him for is that you got arguably the best out of all 4 of your wide receivers last year. All 4 of those guys, London, Mooney, McLeod, and Hodge, either put up career numbers or, in Hodge's case, had more highlight reel plays than he had in the previous years combined. So I think regardless of who winds up being the wide receivers this year, I think it's reasonable to expect that we'll see a repeat of that, and you'll get some of the best football that any of these guys have played in 2025.
Yeah, and I think obviously, like I said, it's important too. I mean, I've said that, even if something happens to Ray, I think they have confidence that Hodge can step in, play that position. Obviously, a bigger guy. Drake London plays more of a power slot at times if he's not playing outside. So they use him in different ways and put him all over the field. So overall, I think the receiving core should be fine. And with Penix, I think some people think that there should even be a higher ceiling in the receiving core just because that completes more big plays, more down the field throws, and things of that nature. So, but one person that people are going to be looking at as he enters his final year with the team, Kyle Pitts. People are trying to figure out, will the Falcons keep him? Will they move him? We have the rumors, they're taking calls, and that makes people kind of be like, it's on the verge of happening. And it's like, we have no idea, guys. Penix has came out and said he thinks him and Pitts can have a great season together. I've said that Penix is probably the biggest arm, most talented quarterback Pitts has had because he had Matt Ryan at the end of his career, then Mariota and Ritter, et cetera, et cetera. And so that could be good for him. It also depends on how they use him this year. What are your expectations for him in his final year? Like what is it that if you are the Falcons and you are trying to decide, hey, should we maybe keep him for at least, even if you want to franchise tag him, 9 times long still extension, what do you want to see from him this year just to be like, okay, we maybe can work with this another year with him and Penix?
I think it's two main things with Kyle Pitts. You want to see the explosive plays, and I think you want to see him, for the first time ever, be a factor in the red zone. He has not really been a factor in the red zone. He was very productive in the red zone at Florida, has virtually been a non-factor for 4 years in the red zone. I think some of that is owed to inconsistency from Kyle Pitts, whether that's, route running, whether it's contested catches. Some of that's owed to inconsistency from particularly last year from Kirk Cousins, but also from the other quarterbacks that the Falcons have had in recent years. And so you just kind of want to see finally that kind of coalesce. You don't need Kyle Pitts to go out there and catch 10 touchdowns or anything like that, but something approaching a half dozen touchdowns and being a semi-reliable option in the red zone, I think would be huge. I think the other thing is just getting that exposed. Like, I don't think you have to run your offense through Kyle Pitts, but it would be nice to kind of see him featured in a couple of ways where you can get a few more explosive plays. We saw glimpses of that during that 6-week stretch from I believe week 5 through week 10, where you got to see a little bit more of Kyle Pitts, particularly on sort of those corner routes, as a vertical threat. And having a number of explosive plays during that stretch of games. And just like, if you can just maintain that rather than a 6-game stretch, if you can get that for, 16 or more games, then that's what I'm really looking for Kyle Pitts. And if you can walk away feeling good about, hey, this guy is an explosive playmaker. We're not running the offense through him. It's the Bijan, I've said it's the big three. It's Bijan, it's Drake, it's Darnell. Those are your big three. But if you can turn that into like a 3.5, where it's like, hey, when defenses are focused on these 3 guys, stopping the run and trying to bracket, Drake and Darnell, and when they forget about Kyle Pitts, and if you can consistently burn them when they do that, that to me is what you're looking for. And then when you get in the red zone, right, primarily Drake London has been their go-to red zone threat. Again, Bijan Robinson running the football along with Tyler Algier is also going to be a big part of the red zone. But it's kind of like, after those first 2 options, can Kyle Pitts be a reliable third option for you in that? And if you do that, then I think you can justify, maybe using that franchise tag or justify potentially trying to re-up him on a long-term contract. And I sit here and I think all of those things are possible, but because we've been sitting here for 4 years now waiting for those sort of breakthrough moments for Kyle Pitts, I don't sit here that optimistic about it, where it's just like, it could happen. I want to see it happen, but until we get to see it again, it goes back to that being in that wait and see mode. It's like all the things are possible for the Falcons, but ultimately they got to go out there and prove it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, with Pitts, I've kind of always said, he's a guy who, like I said, we see the flashes. I mean, you remember the Tampa Bay game from last year, and he had a big game on National Tight End Day. And you just kind of are like, what is it? And I think you hear so many different things, effort, as you mentioned, like route running. But we also see plays where he's open and he just doesn't get the ball, and that's inconsistencies with Kirk. And you're just kind of like, if he could just put it together, then we can maybe have a real discussion. I mean, he caught the game-tying touchdown pass against Washington And when's the last time you ever felt like the Falcons were going Kyle Pitts in a clutch situation? You know what I'm saying? Like, obviously outside of the Chiefs game where we thought that was a penalty for a lot of people did. So I think for him to, just coming out there, just being himself and just showing some consistency, like you said. Plus, I've also said if you trade him, you don't really have that much else in the tight end room. So, Charlie Warner's your tight end one. I guess your next best pass catching tight end is the undrafted free agent from South Carolina, which there's upside. I think they think there's upside there, but I don't know if you want to be like, hey, we need you to be the guy for us this year. So that's just me though. But we'll see what happens with Pitts. So last question before I let you go, man. In general, you said that you were a big critic of Zac Robinson last year, some of the stuff he was doing. And obviously I remember people were like, oh, he's a genius. And then some people were like, what is he doing? So for you this season with Zac, what are the things that you are like, I want to see Zac do this, or I want to see him use a guy like this? Like, what are the things from Zac that you're like, if he does this, you feel like, okay, he's taken another step up as offensive coordinator in his second year?
For me, the main thing is utilizing the play action passing attack more frequently. The Falcons were dead last in the NFL in play action usage, and depending on what stat or metric you look at, they were near dead last when it came to effectiveness with their play action passing. They were certainly at the bottom of the league. And when you look at young quarterbacks like Michael Penix, and you look at the historic number of guys that have had success, a lot of those guys come in offenses that utilize a lot of play action, because one of the benefits of play action is it simplifies the reads. It's like a high-low concept, and if the high concept is open, throw it. If it's not open, check it down to the low concept, and that's how you generate efficient offense for young quarterbacks that are basically figuring it out. And so there really hasn't been much successful young quarterbacks that weren't utilizing play action at a much higher clip than what the Falcons were utilizing. The one possible exception would be maybe Joe Burrow, but even he, even he was using play action probably more than people realize. And, I don't know if it's fair to ask Michael Penix to basically be the equivalent of what Joe Burrow was in his second NFL season, leading the Bengals to the Super Bowl, where you need him to go, nuclear in order for that offense to be effective. And then I also think the play action will, lead to more explosiveness. I think that's going to be probably a big part of what potentially unlocks Kyle Pitts, just because I think after 4 years, we kind of know, even though we were sold on this, like Kyle Pitts being that sort of dominant, line up and beat the man in front of you. Like, he hasn't really been that type of guy, whether you want to blame it on the effort or the route running or whatever you want to blame it on. But I think creating more mismatches with him, basically, using that misdirection that you get from play action, coupled with, it's hard to beat good defenses when you just play straight up, right? If you don't have any misdirection in your game, and we saw this, I think, in that week 1 game against the Steelers, where the Falcons didn't run a single play action snap. And after a certain point in that game, the Steelers kind of like, okay, like, you're not going to do anything. We kind of figured out what you're doing offensively. And after a certain point, like, the Falcons offense really sort of stalled out. And so, like, I think if you're trying to beat playoff caliber defenses, like, you're going to need some sort of misdirection element, because as good as the Falcons are, I don't think they're good enough where they can just simply just line up in a straight drop back offense and just say our guys are better than your guys, and you can't stop us. And so I think play action is going to be the main thing with Zac Robinson. I think if you see a significant improvement there, particularly coming from the coaching tree that he comes from, the Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan coaching tree, where when you look around the league, who are the teams that are the best at play action? They're almost always Shanahan, McVay guys. And when you look at the teams that make the playoffs consistently year in year out, with the exception of basically the Steelers and the Chiefs, right? Because Steelers have their defense and the Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes. Like, everybody else is running, whether they're running play action at a high clip, when they do run play action, they're very effective. Like, Tampa Bay is a good example of a team that didn't run a ton of play action, but was very effective last year with Liam Cohen, who's another McVay disciple. So I feel like Zac needs to live up to the pedigree. And if he can, as a play action play caller, I think that's the main area of growth. There's like small things, diversifying the run game, diversifying the personnel, that I would also like to see from him. But to me, the main thing, if he can show significant growth and this team can be, say, go from worst to at least league average, if not better than that, when it comes to utilizing play action this year, I think that would be a big factor in me saying, okay, Zac, I didn't love what you did in 2024. It was fine. It wasn't bad, but it was just like it's a little underwhelming, given the pedigree. That will be enough for me to go like, okay, I think you're actually good and you're actually living up to the reputation that you had going into the season, where a lot of people were looking at him as sort of the next guy, right? And you kind of saw the guy in Tampa Bay, Liam Cohen, show that he was more of the next guy last year. We'll see what he does in Jacksonville, but I want to see that type of year from Zac Robinson. I think play action will be critical to unlocking that ability.
Yeah, and obviously, like I said, when Zac says he's going to open up the offense, I'm curious to see what that means. I'm curious to know what plays he had to keep, he couldn't use, he couldn't run, and see how it changes things with what they do. Because obviously you hope he hits on. Because people looked at him as like hey, if he hits and the offense is great, he can become a coach in 2 years. Because you know how fast guys can rise up the ranks of coaching. And obviously we don't have to talk about the Jimmy Lake debacle, but we got through it, and that's what matters. But Aaron, I appreciate you, man, coming on to the show, man, talking some Falcons with you, man. Let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, people can check out my stuff on Locked On Falcons on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I don't tweet that much, but you can find me at Locked On Falcons. If you want to follow me on Blue Sky, I don't do the equivalent of what they say on Blue Sky, but this is a family show, so I'm not going to call it what they call it there. But you can find me on Blue Sky at Falcons Fans.
Yes, sir. And obviously, guys, if y'all enjoyed the episode, subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment down below about what we discussed. You can follow me on all social media at Bricey_2K. As we move closer to camp, like I mentioned, it'll be exciting to see what happens, and we'll see what our Falcons do as we get closer to that time. But that's Aaron. I'm Bryce. We'll see you next time.